how do you introduce yourself now? Like, what do you call yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess like now kind of call myself, and well, I should call myself an environmental producer. Like that's like my actual like title. But I think in a lot of times when I try to like explain that to people, I basically like call it quarterbacking between feasibility and like ideation, right? Like, so you're trying to essentially balance all the priorities of like the projects and the individuals and kind of really play a lot of people management. That's definitely like what I feel like my role largely is now, is just like managing the energy of like the group towards like very like difficult, intense like timelines and like goals and things like that. And a lot of time like the experience aspect to like can basically be brought in from like a personnel perspective, but it's how those like personalities like mesh and being able to one just make sure that everyone's on the same page. And also at the end of the day, I was like saying like my meetings that I like to just like remind people that we're all good people at the end of the day. Like this, we're all good people in like not great situations. So like take nothing personally. Everything's kind of really just in service of like the goal, and largely just trying to make sure that we're not like saving lives here. We're just like designing cool spaces.
모스트 보던 팟캐스트.
I think that's a good opportunity to make the intro. Welcome, Ryan, who's our guest on this episode of the Most Modern Podcast. So you told us you're an environmental producer, but you're also an architect, a designer, and you're also now a co-founder at Arcqive. But you did get your start as an architect. Can you walk us through initially kind of why you chose architecture and maybe a little bit of what your experience was like at school?
It's an archive with a Q.
Arcqive with a Q, exactly. Arcqive.world if you're looking for it on the web. And my like intro to architecture was like very unintentional. I was in high school at the time, and I kind of was really into food and like restaurant design, and I was someone that was kind of like your typical like high school student, super into anime, super into like Dragon Ball Z, and it was just like drawing things like that and wanting to. And I kind of like got the like stray idea of like, oh, I'd like to be, before I knew what restaurant design was, I was like, oh, I want to be like an architectural chef. I want to be someone that like designs their own restaurants and things like that.
Nice.
So that kind of put me in a space of wanting to like learn more about that sort of like practice, like drawing and space design and things like that. And I just so happened to be in a public school that had basically like an industrial design course. Our teacher, Coach Penny, David Penny, incredible guy, like really kind of set me off in my career. He had an industrial design course. He had just graduated from Auburn from that program. And he was essentially teaching us all about hand drafting and kind of like shapes and proportions and things like that, largely through Autodesk software. And that was like back in like 2011, when that wasn't really a part of like curriculums, and let alone in like high schools. So he was teaching us Revit way back then.
Wow.
And that was, we were learning how to do like landscape design in like Revit, and learning how to like build little different things just for like this high school course.
You gotta run before you can
amazing.
crawl.
That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And it was like, I had no idea kind of like the context of it at the moment. I was just like, oh, this is kind of like normal. This is how people kind of like get into the field. And when you get to that point in your kind of like junior, senior year, where you're starting to like apply to schools, you start to realize, oh, I need a portfolio. And I'm like, oh, I don't have any sort of portfolio. I've never been to like a summer program that's like specific for like a feeder architecture program. And so I had like 6 months, basically the last semester of junior year, to get that portfolio together. And I just so happened to have like a free period, kind of like your independent study. And I just went to my professor, Coach Penny, and was just like, hey, we have 6 months to like knock out a portfolio. Like, these are the schools I'm like trying to apply to specifically for like architecture programs. Like, I need your help in just getting something feasible together. And we largely hinged off of like the experience using like Revit. And then also he was teaching me like contour drawing, like some hand drafting stuff. So got a little bit of the fundamentals in line there, and then added in all of like the technical, like computational like skills with software. And it actually turned out that like the software side was the more interesting thing that like got me into school. Like I found that out later from the dean of the program that he was like, yeah, like you were doing Revit in like high school and nobody was doing that. So it was
Yeah,
like,
that's
Yeah, I would.
that's
I'd love to see
amazing.
that portfolio. To be honest, the high school Revit portfolio. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like picking up a language, right? Right? Like at that point, you don't go through all those history courses, and you don't constrain yourself from all the knowledge, industry knowledge, but you just jump right in with the tools and just have fun with it. That's how I
totally.
assume it. What's the type? What was your type like? Were you the one who kind of went into the software and go crazy with it, just have fun with making shapes, or were you more concerned? Did the opportunity of using such a expansive tool at the early age, did that give you more freedom or more constraint? Because you can control almost everything in that environment. So I think it's a place where a personality actually shows up. So
Yeah,
what was it like for you?
definitely. It definitely was a space where I feel like I had to create constraints because like I'm not as good at like blank canvas design, right? Like where you kind of like go into an empty space and just let your ideas kind of flow. I have to, if I have that sort of environment, I kind of have to like create a rule set for
Right.
myself or like parameters. So that's how I ended up using Revit in that regard. Like if we had a project, it was like, okay, this is the general kind of like parameters of, I think we were doing maybe like it was like a fire pit kind of like landscape terrace backyard design at the time, I think. And it was like, okay, like I know I'm doing a backyard. So like what do backyards look like? And it's like finding like different, like researching like precedents and things like that and kind of like shapes and not necessarily knowing dimensions that made sense. So, but it was just like kind of doing it by eye and essentially looking at real world examples and trying to like match that
Wow.
digitally just so you can kind of get like somewhat of like a one-to-one and building at least, I guess in that way you were kind of like building your taste of like this looks good to me, and at least like that's where your baseline, and then you kind of like figure out whether or not that like works in the broader context of like does this look good for this like typology of like thing.
Yeah. So you were
So yeah,
training you were training your eye how to
yeah,
see things, how to
inadvertently
look
for
at
sure.
things. Yeah. Nice. Nice.
Oh man, I love Revit, but I don't know if I'd recommend it for all high school students.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you say like that the software part was like a big part of you getting into school. So I guess like where'd you go and where did that translate once you were in school? Like what was the program like? Was there kind of a digital focus?
Yeah, so it wasn't, I went to Syracuse, and so I did their 5 year undergrad program. And there, at the time, there wasn't a huge digital focus. Like it kind of came about midway through our 5 year program. And so it was a little bit of a pullback from like that skill set because the first couple of years were more about like the hand drafting and the technical ability and like the history and kind of understanding proportion more in like a true like architectural what's it called, a true architectural curriculum. And
What
from
was
that
this year?
this was 2011 because I graduated 2016. Yeah, so it was going into like 2011, and like that first couple years was a lot of like hand drafting before we even like got into kind of digital design. And I would say it taught me a lot about like layout and kind of like spatial adjacencies and things like that in a way that I definitely didn't truly understand because in school, in high school, we were just kind of working on like small components of like a space, never like the whole entire like space plan in that way. So I definitely like came into school with like a really specific focus on like symmetry. Like symmetry kind of like felt like the easy like default of like, okay, if it's symmetrical it's good, and then you kind of like learn quickly that you can like break out of that like box and like
Yeah.
do different things. Yeah,
It provides comfort if it's
it
symmetrical. It's
does.
balance, immediate balance.
Yep, yep.
It's also easier to make it in Revit if it's symmetrical.
Yes, exactly.
It's an important parameter for sure. But it's interesting because, Ryan, it seems like a lot of your early, I guess, training was figuring out how to get something rather than what the thing is that you're producing. At least that's what I'm hearing from you. Is that something that you were able to take into your next step after you graduated from school and went into the field?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been like the defining like through line of my career's like process in relation to like design and kind of getting to a thing that is very well thought out, whether or not it's like subjectively beautiful or whatever, like kind of like to like individuals like it was always like very well, I felt like very well thought out, like in terms of like the research. And that definitely took me through like thesis and kind of like understanding that, because how I actually ended up doing my thesis, which was about like workplace design and kind of like the future of like the office, was that I was in a junior year course and we were doing a mixed use project kind of like in like downtown Syracuse with one of those like specific like lots that you're meant to like ideate and create something out of nothing. And I essentially started like researching mixed use buildings and the kind of like future of office. And obviously I came across people like Gensler, and then this upstart company at the time was like WeWork, and I was like, oh, these places are cool. This is like interesting. And I ended up actually cold calling the company, and I was just like, hey, who designs your spaces? Like, I want to talk to them.
Nice.
And they're like, we do. We're like, oh. I was like, oh, what? So it was one of those things where I was really not essentially looking for them, but I ended up kind of like falling into that space. And one of the people that were on the team at the time was alum from like Syracuse. So I ended up talking to them and doing a lot of like research with them about like process and kind of like understanding how they went about like choosing spaces. And that really solidified like my own kind of like natural tendency to try and understand as much as I can when I go to like to create like a solution in anything. Because in architecture school, it's like you're in critiques, and one of the things that really helped ground me in those presentation like moments was that I at least knew that the thing that I researched, I had like researched as much as I could. And I kind of like came to the conclusion as best I could with my like research. And I was always comfortable with like having conversations about like the merit of the solution. But I always felt very uncomfortable if it felt like I didn't do the work to like get to that solution. Because at least it's kind of like getting into a subjective space, but they can't deny that like you like did the process and you kind of like got to a conclusion, whether it was like the right one or not.
Well, this is a kind of a curveball question, but you did a thesis in the future of office, and now the current, and this was less than 10 years ago, but we're in the future now.
Yeah.
Is it different? Is it same?
It's definitely different. It's different for me for sure. Like me in an office environment was like the exact opposite of what I probably like put together in like my like thesis and things like that. Like
Right.
I'm much more of like I wouldn't say like reclusive, but I'm very much like in my zone, even when I'm like in the office. So like if you see me in an office, I usually have my headphones on. I'm usually kind of like doing the task, and I'll break off from the task for like little things, but I'm not someone that's like very social or kind of like roaming around the space, but I'm not antisocial in that way. So like
You're
working
not
from
always in
home,
meetings or anything
right?
like that.
Exactly. And like working from home kind of like fits that entire dynamic, because it just allows me to really like hone in on exactly what I need to be doing at the moment, and then like break off for walk around the neighborhood or do whatever. It's just like a different version of that.
Which is interesting because you've also designed a lot of office space. So I guess like when you're a worker in an office you didn't design, in an office that you designed, and now at home where I guess you have full control over your environment, I guess like how do you make some of the design decisions in each of these scenarios?
Well, for in my home, it was really all about like workspace, like being able to have like clean, comfortable workspace. I definitely have started to fall into the trap of like the workstation, like where you have like your monitor on the wall, you have your laptop dock, your mic, and all the things, and kind of like the beauty of just like the workstation. It's definitely like become my aesthetic a little bit. And I think like a lot of times the things that I try and focus on in like my personal space are like some of like the things that we really like harped on when we were doing a lot of like workspace design, which is like circulation, kind of like ease of flow, of being able to like create kind of like comfortable pockets and like zones of space, and also like economy of space, like layouts that are really efficient, create as much like free flow space, but also like stack elements together to create like storage and things like that. Like we all have lived in New York or currently live in New York, and like space is just like in very short supply. So being able to try and like economize that and create more with like less it's definitely the mindset that I bring into like my personal space, which ends up being like my workspace as well.
So you went through, I guess, WeWork was your first job,
Yeah,
and you went
right out of
through
school.
what I would consider like an entire career journey by the time you're out. You went from a design intern to a project architect to a design lead. So what was that, I guess, like rapid growth and transition like for you to kind of have a whole career compressed in six years, right?
Yeah, 6 years. It was really interesting. Like it was kind of like incredible at the time. And it's really, I found that I loved being really close to the innovation, like to like
Hmm.
the process improvements, to like the forward thinking and things like that. But I've also always knew that I kind of like had to put in the time and like the work to have the experience to influence like said process and things like that. So like, when I really started as like a design intern, really like being a project coordinator and things like that, you learn a lot about process. You learn about the business and like how the business kind of like prioritizes what makes a great WeWork at the time, or what makes a great process for design, and what the kind of like factors are. I really was lucky enough to work across all different sectors and all different territories. So it was based in North America, and this was before we kind of had like a big distributed team that could kind of like systematize their processes like locally. We
Hmm.
were working across time zones, so we would talk to Europe, we would talk to Asia, we would talk to Latin America, and you got to learn about like the differences and the nuances of like product in different countries and the ways that things need to like flex and pull. And at a certain point, I kind of got as far as I think I probably could have with like process
Hmm.
without being able to really inject my own kind of like experience of like building the spaces, right? So I had to really get in the weeds and kind of like learn how to build the spaces. One, just to obviously like be able to come with that mindset, but
Hmm.
also because there's always a tension between the people creating process and the people executing like the product.
Hmm.
And I think when I was interning outside of like WeWork and outside of all these like spaces, I was always lucky enough to be close to decision makers. But I always kind of like knew when it got to the point of, and kind of like frankly, like gaining respect of like the people that are really like producing the work. You gotta
Right.
get in the trenches. Like you gotta actually like do it, you
It's
know?
really interesting
So yeah.
that it feels like you had the opposite of experience of a lot of people where they kind of learn to build first and then they kind of escalate into management and see and take a charge of like a lot more of the process. But like you kind
Yeah.
of went the opposite way. You did the process and kind of the exposure first and then went into the actual execution. I guess like what was the difference when you were designing process versus when you actually got to experience what implementing your process looked like?
With defining process, it was a lot more tool based, and kind of like learning how to make software work for your specific product and like process that you want to produce. So I think that was a lot more like conceptual in terms of like using like the different like software tools. Like Lebo, we use a lot of like Airtable, and it was like, how do we make Airtable this like dashboard software? And this was like early before Airtable was like what it is like now. So we
Mm.
were pushing the limits of like what it actually could
Back
feasibly
when they still
do.
had blocks.
Yeah, exactly. The like age old kind of like, why can't databases connect to each other? And that was really like I think the fun part of that, of looking at what we wanted to accomplish and kind of breaking that into like bite-sized chunks and kind of saying, okay, this is the goal. This is the steps that it's going to take to the goal. Like, how can we kind of like systematize that into like the most like replicable pieces and create something that's deployable, scalable to a certain degree. And then in comparison to like actually producing the projects, that was a lot of time management, like people management. And it was always, the gates to get to success were always like there and very like transparent and aware of like what it took to do that. And it's really like the minutia of like the people management of like, there's
Right.
people involved in all these like gates, so you can't just look at it as like
Yeah.
a
Do you
sheet
mean
of
for
paper.
the process side or for the actual execution side that these
The
like milestones
actual,
and gates were
yeah,
being
the
put?
actual execution side, because you can set up the project with the milestones and you know you're meant to like hit these gates. But then you get different teams with like different skill sets, and you kind of have to like QC the work that's coming out both internally and externally, and manage those frustrations at like times, manage the like timelines and what's important, what's not important, like what can be figured out kind of in field ad hoc, and having like great partners to really develop that process with or develop the product with. That was the main difference between like process and like execution. Like process was very like, there's a goal. It's very black and white of like whether or not we like achieve this goal. And the project execution, as much as it is like black and white, there's like a lot of different pathways to like success in that way.
Right. This is interesting because I think we all deal with this challenge, which is we have an idea for something, but especially in the built environment, we're not the ones who are going to implement it. We need to work with a team. We need to work with contractors. We need to work with the city potentially to implement it. But what you're talking about, Ryan, is you're not just building a building, which is a product which everyone sort of knows already, but you're creating a new product in itself. So there's this added layer. Is that the main, I guess, difficulty that you face? And I get also, we've had other tech founders on the show. Is that something that is distinct from just building a building, that you have to create the sort of new idea of what the product is going to be? It's not necessarily going to be a building. In this case, it was workspaces or, something totally unfound before.
Yeah, totally. I think that is definitely the hardest complexity, because you're trying to create the thing, and then you're also trying to create it at scale. You're trying to create a level of consistency and like brand in a physical space that's probably the most akin, and now there's a lot of like versions of it, so it's a little more like known, but at the time it was probably like the most akin to like storefront rollout and like store design and things like that, where you have a lot of like brand standards associated with it, and it's more like retail based. But when you got into like workspace, like every single block of like office was a different individual with like different priorities and like different aesthetics. And how do you create a space that's like flexible enough for people to be unique in like what they do, but also like hits the kind of like general benchmarks of what everybody needs in like an office?
Well, you're trying to hit the two most difficult items, which is uniqueness, creativity versus scale. So you want to deploy in a fastest scale in the vastest amount, and WeWork was doing it internationally. Yet every single store needs to have its character. So you're trying to hit you're trying to hit a home run in every time you're on the base. So I can imagine the difficulty there. But I'm sure it was also a humbling experience, because my experience coming from design to development also was not that dissimilar from yours, where you learn a lot in terms of the design and you have your ideas and concepts and grand visions. But once you start trying to realize that, you understand, oh, this is what's in my head cannot just be directly implemented and become like a building, right? Like there are so many disciplines involved. So yeah, I'm glad that you had that experience.
Yeah. And I was going to ask, I'm sure on your end that like the development side of it, with when you're really more directly working on the performa end of it, and like all of the municipality kind of like factors that you have to like really include into like the design. And I'm not sure if you work on the more like ground up spaces, like where you're kind of like working on the entire like tower designs and things like that, and like the public space. How do you kind of navigate your design background in relation to like the development priorities?
Yeah, I think architecture and developer, to be a good one, you need to be a great communicator. Like whatever the subject and the goal is for that meeting, you have the tools to deliver a very concise message. And also having that clarity helps you to helps other peoples to join in and chime in, and just say, helps to make that decision on spot. So you're trying to, as a developer and as the owner of the project, you're trying to push that flow and have that flow kind of concise and very succinct and effective as much as possible. So I think being a designer, having the graphical tools and understanding of the vision and the goal of the project, you can speak different languages, and I think that's the greatest strength of a designer, that you can talk to people about the building, about the goals of the building in many different ways. So I'm interested in, you said there were a couple of initiatives that you founded within WeWork, and one was We of Color while you're at WeWork. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I'm very curious
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say I co-founded it with a lot of really like talented individuals. And truly, I was kind of the tack on to like the first wave of it. Like there were basically four individuals: Lindsay Baker, Rocky. And I know Rocky Kearns. Everyone knows him as Rocky. His name is Rashawn, but Tiffany Harden and Andrew Johnson. They were all incredibly like pivotal to like making We of Color like what it was like when I was able to like join the group. And We of Color was essentially an employee research group for like all people of color at WeWork. It's like to call it like an entrepreneurial like organization, in that we created basically an organization within WeWork, like
Yeah.
at the time when there was not really an infrastructure for like ERGs at the company at the time. So it was a lot of foundational work around like how do ERGs like function at WeWork, and like what can they really do, like are there kind of like spaces that we can operate in, and what are the type of initiatives that we can like work on. And what kind of started as like really just a group chat on Google Chats and Meet or in Gmail ended up becoming like a 700 person Slack group, I believe, at the time. And we essentially scaled this entire organization to be able to have different events on a like monthly cadence, having a lot of like tentpole events around cultural, like monthly, I forget the kind of like name for how you describe it, but essentially like Black History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, Women's History Month, things like that. And trying to like bring in the skill set of the company to the benefit of like the ERG. So I was mainly working on the design and kind of like graphics ends of it, because I had a little bit of like experience in Adobe Illustrator and kind of like building decks and layouts and things like that. And I thought it was going to be like a really fun endeavor to like work with them on like the design for like their flyers and things like that. Largely it was the main kind of aspect, and this is kind of like the competitive mindset in myself. I was just like, I wanted We of Color, I wanted people to be like envious of like the work that We of Color was like putting out, and I wanted them to feel like this was quality work that you would pay people to like actually produce within the company for an event, like for any other like process. Because I felt like that was the way that we were definitely going to get taken seriously as like an organization, and that we weren't just kind of like putting together odds and ends events where it was just meant to kind of be a space for camaraderie. Like there were events where we were raising money for different organizations. We were producing merch. Like had sales. Like we ended up doing fundraising and kind of more charity associated endeavors. And I think it really
So
got to
maybe
a space like
something like to help us establish a baseline on is like, what is an employee resource group and what is its role, I guess, across companies at a certain size? And I guess also you were kind of growing an organization within an organization. So what was that dynamic like, especially for maybe a company that didn't have a established like employee resource group kind of standard?
Yeah, employee resource groups kind of have evolved since I was like working with one, and they've changed quite a bit. So I'd say like at the time they were more so spaces for people, and this was really like our mission statement at the time, were spaces for people to feel like seen, heard, and like included. So you're in a big organization, a lot of times you don't feel like there's a lot of people that have your background, have your experience, can relate to things that you see in the workspace, and you don't have like an outlet to come talk about them. So a lot of times like ERGs are just simply a safe space for employees to have that outlet to speak about the things that they're going through in the workplace. And if you find like that kinship and that friendship about outside of the workplace, and really trying to create the camaraderie like in the office. And I'd say like what it took to grow it was a lot of, one, just grit and kind of being able to give your time outside of your main job to grow this organization. And at a certain point, we essentially got to the point where it was just too big for us to be doing as like a offshoot of our main job. And so
Right.
that's when it got like much more strategic of trying to partner with the different departments in the company to be able to like input their resources for those goals.
Mm.
So like if I'm doing graphic design, WeWork had like an incredible graphic design department. Like why can't we ask for like one or two like resources for like a small like event that we're doing down the line and kind of get into like templatization, like all that sort of stuff. And I think that's what really got us to a point where we could grow it, was just starting to see how we could inject ourselves into the priorities of the different departments and their like OKRs and goals for the year.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense for WeWork because from what I see as an outsider, they seem to be championing in those small groups, organized like grassroots groups within the group. And that contributed in making that image of a very vibrant workspace that not just WeWork creates, but they have internally as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know that it didn't end well. And how did you? And we would like to ask, like, what your experience was, because you were. I don't know if you were there until the very end, or how did you? What made you decide to leave? And you've done amazing jobs, and WeWork also helped you to grow a lot within the group. I bet it was a difficult decision for you to depart from WeWork, but what made you do that? What motivated you?
Yeah, it was definitely a scary decision, just given the time like that we were in at the moment. Because I wasn't in the first wave of like layoffs. We were kind of in this wave where we were given the opportunity to either stay or take our severance package and move on. And at that time, it was the end of 2020, going into like 2021. So we were pretty much like height of the pandemic, and it was like, we don't know if you're gonna get a job. You don't know like what the next move is. And I think for me, and the thing that helped me make the decision was definitely like my parents, my girlfriend, like all of their kind of like encouragement. But I think for what made me know that it was time was that the trajectory for WeWork to get back on track was just so long, and it was more of like, I don't see myself growing in a rebuild phase for a company that needs to like get back to like baseline. And I want to kind of like put myself in a position to grow career wise and like skill set wise. And the only way I can do that is like outside of this company. And so that's why I personally decided to leave and pursue other things. And that took me right into freelancing, which was an entire experience in and of itself of just learning how to be an entrepreneur in that way.
But your freelancing is, I guess, like what connected you to a little bit of what you do now, right?
Yeah.
I guess, can you key us into a little bit of your work at Verb and what it's like to work in agency versus where you worked before?
Yeah. And again, the work with We of Color really pushed me into the agency work. So Tiffany Harden, who was one of the main founders for like We of Color, was actually the one that introduced me to the founders of Verb, which is the agency that I work at full time now. And at the time, I was interested in kind of like understanding how the skill sets like transferred. So I was speaking to like friends, speaking to other people in the creative agency field to kind of understand if an architect coming from like more of like a traditional like workspace background would be able to like translate their skills or have any sort of like place in an agency world. And it just so happened that a lot of the work was very similar. And I kind of just like had a conversation with the co-founders of Verb on like a whim to understand what their process was and like their work, because they've done so many incredible things at the time. They worked on a campaign for a show from HBO called I May Destroy You. And at the time I was like seeing all the work that they were doing during the pandemic and still being able to like put out really great experiences, and just had a conversation about that and asked them generally like, did they think the skill sets would transfer? And it was kind of like a really casual conversation that was just like, yeah, I think it would. Like, we have some stuff coming up. And it just so happened that the first project that they wanted me to work on with them was a project with Airbnb for Outcast and the Dungeon in Atlanta. And so was the first like freelance project that I had coming out of WeWork. And so that really kind of like catapulted me into the freelance like space and also the creative agency space. And it wasn't essentially like a rocket ship from like there, but that was like an incredible experience where it taught me a lot about that space and like the ways that the skill set can transfer. And then I was able to kind of like build up different experiences from a freelance perspective before I've most recently started full time with Verb as an environmental producer on the creative agency side.
Can you explain the type of work relative to, say, stuff you were doing before or in architecture? What is a creative agency? What is an environmental producer? How does that differ from traditional design? And
Yeah.
what types of kind of interactions do you have with your clients?
Yeah. Yeah, so Verve is really like an experiential creative agency. They focus on creating authentic experiences with transformative and forward-thinking brands. So they've done a lot of work with Airbnb. They've done work with Pinterest. They've done work with a summit called ROI. And so they really focus on making these in-person, in real life, incredible experiential environments and events. And so at the time, and my role, particularly with them as environmental producer, is really to be the in between of production and creative design. So, in an architecture standpoint, that would be like project management and interior design. So, the business and the creative, essentially. And so, as an environmental producer, which is very similar to my role at like WeWork as an architect, is trying to bridge the gap between those two things. Because we all know the design costs money. The project manager is supposed to keep the budget in line. And so having someone that can kind of like speak to both ends and advocate on both sides and really try and be a mediator to a degree and help quarterback the ship to a successful project or a successful event, that's essentially what the environmental production role is for me now in the creative agency, and kind of the similarities between architecture within a firm and design and production within an agency.
So the projects aren't necessarily buildings, right? They might be an event, they might be something, a pop-up or something along those lines, something a little bit more
Yeah.
temporal.
Yeah, generally all physical space could be an event in terms of like temporary structures and systems being like brought in to create this environment, particularly like for a brand. And then in certain cases, when we work with like bigger brands like Airbnb, it can be like fully physical spaces that we're building out and essentially like designing to replicate whichever IP or like brand that's associated with like the structures.
So I think what was interesting is like when you were working at WeWork, right? You were largely focused on space, and experience was kind of secondary, right? Like, great, we want to produce great experiences, but really the space comes first. And it seems like with your work at Verb, it's almost the opposite. You're like, hey, this is the experience that we're aiming for. The space is a part of that, so the space is kind of subservient to that experiential idea. So I guess like from a quarterback standpoint, someone who has to maybe massage and make sure the pieces kind of come together in the right way. What are some of the differences? Like, can you cut some weird corners to pursue an experience that you can't do when you're trying to look at the bottom line on a office project?
I would actually say no if you want it to be of like the highest quality. I would say like there's differences in that, like in fabrication versus like permanent construction, though walls aren't permanent, right? So like there's a level of flexibility with the creative there. You can do more things quickly, or rather you can do more things like off site, right? It's like you can produce and like fabricate a lot of things in shop and kind of like build the entire thing like on site quicker than you would from like a ground up construction perspective, because everything happens on site. So your kind of like build time is really long on the actual venue side. And then when you're in like a fabricator, you can build it all pretty much like in shop, test it, prototype it, and do things like that. But I would say if you want it to feel fully like immersive and fully kind of like thought out and have like a high level of fidelity, there does need to be more specificity to the way that you're designing it. So I wouldn't say you can cut corners, but you get a lot of benefit from like the style of like production that you're doing in that way.
No, we'll just leave that inconspicuous gap in this recording. But I want to make sure we get some time to talk about Arcqive, this startup that you co-founded, which solves a problem that you're really passionate about. So can you give us, I guess, the investor pitch on Arcqive and what you're trying to do there?
Yeah, so I guess the elevator pitch would be that Arcqive is a platform for architects and designers, and mainly a portfolio platform. So the idea is that we're trying to create a space for people to go from content to curation and presentation in like the press of a button, or as quick as possible, essentially. And from a key learning of all of us who have like been in the design world and go for jobs, go for awards, go for different sort of like outlets in relation to our work and our portfolios, having to like curate those things and create different versions and different write-ups associated with our work becomes very like cumbersome and requires like a myriad of tool sets. Like we all know different platforms that are meant for display of like portfolios, different platforms that are meant for the consolidation of portfolios and the creation of like the portfolio, and then obviously like website design and an outlet of like creativity around like your actual design ethos and your kind of like eye towards that brand. And I would say Arcqive is meant to be a utility in that way that brings your work into a central location, allows you to disseminate it to wherever you need in the most simple and seamless way.
So I guess you have a co-founder, Hassan, right? So what
Yep.
role do you play in the company? And I guess how's your dynamic?
Yeah, it's actually really good. It's been a really cool experience because we both have an architecture background. His more directly in research, obviously like mine more directly in design, and so we kind of work well with each other in that dynamic. In that he's really good at setting up the foundations of how we build the entire like platform. Like what are the key kind of like through lines that we're trying to hit from a mission statement perspective, from like an IA perspective, like what are the real beats that we're trying to hit. And then for me, I'm more so on the kind of like design side, so like the product design side. And a lot of it has been like a huge learning experience of growing our skill set in that space, kind of translating our skill set from physical space design and like physical space research into like digital design and like digital research and UX and UI and things of that nature. And so it's really been a great dynamic of like feeding off each other and kind of bettering each other and our skill sets as we both like work in full-time capacities and kind of bring even some of those learnings into the product.
So in simple terms, if I am a student or someone who needs a portfolio, I go to archive.world, and then
Yep.
what do I do? Do I have to submit a model, and does your platform does it for you, or do I have to like submit the renderings? Like, can you break it down a little?
Yeah, so you can pretty much submit everything that you would usually like associate with like a portfolio or a project in your portfolio. So you have your final images, you have your drawings, you have your models. So we created basically a space for the project page, right? So you have three spaces essentially, like your projects, your collections, and then your collaborators. And that's how we're building out the base features of the platform, and with the intention to kind of like build more. So with projects, it's essentially like a project index of all your different work. And so when you start a project, you would upload the information associated with it, name, company description, highlights, and then you would also add in any images associated with it. You would add in any videos that you have associated with it, models, and we kind of integrated a 3D model viewer that's pretty seamless on like mobile and seamless on desktop to be able to kind of like move around with like most all of the file types except for Autodesk file types, essentially, because they have their own proprietary kind of like software in that regard. And so it's really meant to house all of your file types that are associated with a project and allow you to present it in the way that you want it to be presented in the context of the work.
Oh, I see.
And
So
yeah,
is it a portfolio that lives online, or is it a portfolio that's more of a static as a PDF file that you give out?
lives
As a,
online.
lives
Yeah,
online. Oh, that's
yeah,
nice.
lives online. Yeah, and we really like the idea of being utility first in that regard. So being able to house all your different like content types, allow you to put it into the configuration that you would want in relation to the way that the project is displayed, and then also be able to create collections in that regard. So if you have say 30 projects and you want to only put together a grouping of your sustainability projects, you can tag all those projects in that relation. You can add them to a collection, and you can send that collection for a job posting for like sustainability designer in that regard. Or you could do the same for if you're or a professor going for accreditation and you have a course that you have students that are all working in the thing. So it's really about like kind of the curation of the work, having a place to index it all, and then put it into different like groupings and disseminate it out to the various different outlets that you need.
I haven't thought of a course director or an instructor using it, but it will be very useful in that case. Like if you're running a studio.
I think this is where like the really powerful thing about what they're doing is like if you think about a lot of like student use cases from use cases, is all about kind of putting your body of work into a subset in order to present the story the way that you need for like a particular audience. And this is, you know, Ryan being able to kind of build software that cuts out a lot of this manual process in order for you to get to that result a lot quicker. And this is where I see like a lot of promise, I think, in what you guys are doing. And it's in beta right now, right? So can you get these guys some invites to check it out?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so if you definitely want to check it out, like I'll send you the link for the beta, and we're having everybody like give as much feedback. All feedback is good feedback, and we're trying to make sure that it's working for people in the way that they would need it to, and then intake those changes, make it even better, and ultimately get as many people on the platform as we can.
Ryan, we're starting to ask this question to all of our guests. It seems like experience is something that is becoming more and more critical rather than the object itself. Part of it is visualization and dissemination of experiences through social media. So the question, how would you describe the era that we're in? And based on your work or based on what you see around us?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I obviously like we're all like children of like the digital era. So like we exist in very like fast paced culture and like meme culture, and the trends and the vibes like change so drastically. Still, I feel like we're in like an era where people really want to get out in like physical environments, but they still, the power of like the digital space is like still very, very, very strong. Like I think there's like a big push to kind of get people back into physical spaces, like physical events, like physical kind of like concerts, restaurants, like things like that. Like the creation of like physical space is in a really interesting position now, because you can create a lot of like genre defining and genre kind of like fusions within like physical space for a lot of the work that like I see now, like with like the work I'm doing with the creative agency. Like that's not necessarily one thing versus the other. It's kind of like a melding of two. And I live in Williamsburg, so like you walk around, you kind of see these like fusion spaces as well, like hybrid listening bars that are also kind of like hi-fi restaurants that have like incredible like speaker design and things like that. And that's like a very like physical environment, but there's still a real kind of like layer of like there's a digital presence to like everything. So it's interesting. I feel like we're kind of like in a moment where everything is available to everyone. So like you can kind of be whatever you want to be, like in a way, but you can dabble in whatever you want to, but there's always kind of like the bread and butter of like what it is that you do.
Well, maybe in that regard, the idea that we were talking about before, it's about curation, right? Like everything is accessible, but we still need someone to kind of put it all together and present it to us, because otherwise you might get overwhelmed, right? There's too many experiences, there's too much stuff around you to choose from. I sort of see that in social media, for instance. I mean, any feed is a curation of probably your own interest based on the algorithm, but also in entertainment through streaming and digital advertising, basically targeting specific people for different things. And I think it's interesting because that's starting to appear, it seems like, through your work in the physical realm as well.
He's basically mixing a space that only existed in a film or online, but is very popular, and you're bringing it back to reality. So you're actually the other way around, like, right? So like architecture, we fascinate about the actual buildings, and then that becomes a canon, and then it starts to exist online and on books. But you're like going to the opposite route, where these famous spaces that has this character, you're bringing real life, so for the people to experience it. So I think that work alone is very fascinating to me. So even furthering this mix of things.
Yeah, it's definitely like a fun space to like work in, because
Yeah.
you kind of you really get to like stretch your creative like tool set and bring fidelity to like very nebulous like ideas and spaces, and like kind of to the degree that we talked about, like the feeling is really important, because a lot of brand is like associated like with the feeling, like what is the thing that you're trying to make people like feel at the end of the day. And whether it be like a really big brand like Airbnb that has like their own sort of like ethos that they want this program to have a through line of, the actual like IPs associated with each individual project has its own kind of like ethos. So you kind of have to like balance the two, and that's like an interesting conflict and like tension, that if you like do it right, you get something like super successful, as they have for the last like year and a half, two, or actually like 2-3 years at this point. And now you get to kind of like see what that looks like at scale, and like what that actually like translates into from like a physical space perspective. And I think that's one of the things that software always has like over physical spaces, like scale and like scalability. But it's something that's, I don't think people want 100% of like one or the other.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of the Most Modern Podcast. Of course, thank you, Ryan, for being our guest. If you haven't already, please give us a follow or a subscribe wherever you're listening. That really helps. And we will be back next Monday with another episode.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yay.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
모스트 포던 팟캐스트